Conjure in your mind a 1,000-year time-lapse of the Amazon rainforest, the camera high above Earth's surface. Nothing much seems to happen until the last few frames. Change is barely perceptible from this height, but at ground level, change is constant. For centuries, people have sculpted the forest. They cut and burn it to make space for the fruit and nut trees that they need. When they move on, the forest closes in and covers their tracks. In places, the detritus of human life is compacted into black soils a kilometre deep, made of burned seeds, pods, husks, leaves, bark and root, shards of pottery, ruined fragments of houses, and the ceremonial mounds that connected living people to their ancestors. Everything is movement. Epiphytes grow with their roots in the air, trapping soil on the wind. Vines climb and strangle as they provide passage for forms of life unnamed and innumerable. Rivers muscle their way to new paths. The death of each aged tree brings a disruptive explosion, creating life from decay. Beneath the profound green of the canopy, there lives a kaleidoscope of colour. Pinpricks of blue radiate from the flapping wings of morpho butterflies, each little wing made of 1,000,000 tiny overlapping scales that produce a lustrous structural colour. The red and white of copaiba and the violet of jacarandas intensify the palette. The forest bursts into mass flowering every few years. From above, everything is still. And then you get to the 1960s. Bare patches start to puncture the green. By the 1980s, it is like a contagion. Roads appear like veins carrying flatbed trucks. If the photographs could sing, a single keening note would rise above the symphony of the forest, the sound of the chainsaw. Smoke obscures your vision. The forest ends in flames. For the world's tropical rainforest concentrated in Amazonia, Central Africa and Southeast Asia, the 1980s were uniquely catastrophic. Of all the great accelerations of the second half of the 20th century, none was as abrupt and few were as consequential. In the 1980s, the planet lost 150 million hectares of tropical rainforest, an area half the size of India. The greatest losses were in the Brazilian Amazon, followed by the forest of the Indonesian archipelago. Never in recorded human history, neither in temperate nor in tropical lands, neither in modern nor in pre-modern times, were so many trees killed so quickly. More than 15 billion trees fell each year. The term biodiversity only entered English in the late 1980s, in conjunction with the loss of the forest, and it remains an abstract, distant way to convey what has been lost through this extraordinary assault. What was lost, what is still being lost, is a community of living beings, 15% of all the species on Earth. Working together, they capture more sunlight than any other ecosystem. They recycle a significant portion of all the rainfall on the planet and store billions of tons of carbon that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere. The Amazon and the Indonesian rainforests are also home to many indigenous communities whose well-being is tied to the life of the forest and who are denied the political voice to protect it. The attack on the Amazon began with roads laid with caterpillar earth movers crashing through the forest. It began with the populist democratic government of the 1950s, which had promised Brazilians freedom through oil. In 1960, the government inaugurated the BR-153 highway. Traversing 1,900 kilometers, it connected the port city of Belém, coastal gateway to the vast Amazonian region of Pará, with the country's purpose-built new modernist capital of Brasilia. With the expansion of the highway system into southeastern Pará, parts of the rainforest that were inaccessible came within range of a great migration. Land grabbers and speculators, small family farmers and impoverished people without land, they all followed the road into the forest. And when the road was paved, even more people made the journey. They went in search of freedom from the precarity of life in Brazil's arid northeast. Those who already had power and resources went in search of quick profits. The highway tore through the forest like a river of fire, leaving a broad swathe of denuded land stretching for miles on either side of its path. The greatest portion of newly deforested land went to ranchers, who turned the rainforest into pasture for cattle that they raised for beef. They remade the ecology of Amazonia so fast and so fully that it would have consequences for all the world. The death of the forest served many needs, but above all, it served the needs of cattle. Brazil's military coup of April 1964 hastened the conquest of the Amazon. The takeover was backed by the CIA and celebrated by the US establishment as a victory against communist forces. The junta's most fervent supporters included big ranchers, alongside the most conservative sections of the Catholic Church. For landowners, the coup was a bonanza. The state dangled wildly attractive financial incentives before speculators. These giveaways were a death warrant for the forest. Amazonian occupation will proceed as though we are waging a strategically conducted war, said General Castello Branco in 1964. Even as it funneled land and power toward the wealthy, the military spoke the language of social justice. The government's aim, General Emilio Medici said, was to open up a land without men for men without land. The motto, ever masculine, tapped into old ideas of pioneer settlement. The junta's showcase scheme was the Trans-Amazonian Highway, which opened in 1972. It ran 5,400 kilometers from east to west and cut right through the rainforest. The government's stated goal, ambition, and alluring was to grant land to 100,000 families within 5 years. In the end, only 8,000 came. Their dreams of a better life died in Amazonian soils too poor in nutrients to sustain small farming. Instead, the ranchers moved in to amass even more pasture. A new frontier of gain lay in soybean plantations, as Brazil rose to become the world's largest producer of a crop that industrial American agriculture had elevated to a position of supremacy as animal feed ever since the Second World War. The state of Rondônia, further still from Brazil's center of population, experienced the swiftest change of all. With another motorized acronym came another pathway to material freedom and another engine of loss. The BR-364 from Cuiabá to Porto Velho carried 160,000 migrants into Rondônia each year between 1984 and 1988. Settlers came from impoverished parts of the Nordeste, many of them Afro-Brazilians in search of viable subsistence. Others took the 4-day journey north by coach from Parana, a region that had prospered from the export of coffee until hit by crop disease. The rapid intrusion of large soy plantations left local farming families, mostly of European descent, unable to compete, so they packed up and took their chances up the highway. All of Brazil's monstrous inequalities of race, wealth, and political power, collided to propel the destruction of the forest. Humble migrants' hopes of sufficiency and safety faded, while the coffers and the paramilitary forces of landowners swelled. The indigenous people of Amazonia suffered the violent destruction of their homes. They faced the irreparable loss of the ecosystems they depended on. Chainsaws and fire obliterated a whole web of kinship, human and more than human. In Brazil, the producers of beef and soy orchestrated the destruction, while in Indonesia, rainforests fell to plantations of timber and palm oil. Just a year after the coup in Brazil, the CIA threw its weight of covert operations behind a military coup in Indonesia in 1965, led by the canny and dogged General Suharto, against the charismatic, erratic, and left-leaning Sukarno, Indonesia's founding president. Suharto's supporters slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Indonesians, targeting Indonesia's Chinese communities and opponents they branded as communists. In Indonesia, as in Brazil, the military regime plundered nature for handouts to patch together a creaky coalition of supporters. Beginning in the 1970s, loggers and plantation companies incinerated swathes of rainforest in Borneo, Sumatra, and Sulawesi. Settlers followed from Indonesia's heartland of population and political power, Java, sponsored by a government scheme of frontier colonization. The project of transmigrasi, or transmigration, with origins in the Dutch colonial era, treated people like timber, as a resource to be managed. Just as in Brazil, the self-propelled movement of small farmers and families without land took place alongside and probably outstripped the schemes of official resettlement. Fire was the fastest way to clear the ground to turn rainforests into lucrative timber and palm oil plantations. The newcomers intensified the local practice of ladang, which had long made use of fire in the practice of shifting cultivation. Used on a small scale, fire had nourished and replenished the soil over centuries. Used on an industrial scale, fire became uncontrollable. Drought eased its spread. For the first time in 1982, an El Niño year, the forests of Kalimantan burned out of control. Logging had mottled the forest with patches of dry, open ground, making a floor of kindling. The crisis of Indonesia's forest galvanized widespread concern from students, academics, and clubs of nature lovers across the country. The influential news magazine, Tempo, founded and edited by dissident poet and playwright Goenoan Muhammad, featured regular columns under the heading Lingkungan, or environment, starting from around 1976. The term Lingkungan brought together diverse concerns: the loss of forests, the threats faced by birds and animals, urban air and water pollution, flooding, and land rights. In keeping with the new international norms that emerged following the first UN Environment Conference in 1972, Suharto's government created a Ministry of the Environment in 1978, and Berkeley-trained economist Emil Salim was put in charge. In 1980, a broad coalition of civil society groups came together to constitute WALHI, Wahana Lingkungan Hidup Indonesia, or the Indonesian Environment Forum. Just a few years after its founding, WALHI counted more than 350 member organizations across the country. As Environment Minister, Emil Salim proved receptive to working with WALHI and allied groups, so long as they did not stray beyond strictly environmental questions, which were deemed less threatening to state power than, for instance, land rights. But what the new order conceded, it just as quickly took away. The profits to be made from destruction were simply too great. The booming global market for the products of Indonesia's forest enriched land speculators who belonged to the country's tight-knit political and financial elite. Suharto plundered Indonesia's vast natural wealth to finance his promise of progress and development to his constituents. By many measures, he succeeded. Indonesia became the World Bank's poster child for the benefits of market-led development. But each year, the fires burned longer. Indonesian journalists described the fires of 1987 as a sea of fire, and the country's forests as the charred lungs of the earth. Along the way, Suharto made his family and his associates wealthy beyond measure. One of the president's favoured lieutenants was Bob Husson, who held millions of hectares in timber concessions. Husson was dubbed the Plywood King. His companies and front companies lay behind many of the fires that burned. The son of a modest Chinese tobacco trader in the city of Semarang, Husson gripped the ladder to power and wealth through a century when the Indonesian Chinese faced repeated atrocities. His corruption grew obscene, his powers of destruction immense. In the story of the rainforest death in Brazil and Indonesia, avatars of greed are not hard to find. The Alves family of Acre, Brazil, appear as something close to archetypal villains. From the 1960s to the 1980s, they murdered and terrorized their way northward, accumulating land, raising militias, and annihilating forest. They formed part of a cabal of ranchers who used violence to impress their will along the highways into Amazonia. And in 1988, they would conspire to take the life of one of Brazil's most prominent environmental activists. Only in the mid-1980s, when he was 40 years old, did the word ecologia enter Chico Mendes' political lexicon. Until then, he had seen his fight as a very old one, a fight against the brutal unfreedom of bonded labour, which still prevailed among the Amazonian rubber tappers, from whose ranks Mendes had emerged as a leader. Chico Mendes' parents formed part of a large migration of labour to the region of Acre during the Second World War, when Allied demand for Brazilian rubber surged because of the Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia. Workers endured abusive conditions, bonded by debt to the rubber barons who used loans and lethal force to keep workers on the hook for life. Indigenous workers faced conditions even harsher than migrant workers from the south. The same form of debt bondage trapped workers who harvested piassava, the coarse palm fibers used to make brooms. The most mundane of domestic objects produced at scale came at huge cost to human life and to the ecology of the forest. As a young person, Chico Mendes was schooled on weekends by a lifelong rebel and labor organizer, Euclides Fernandez Tavora. In 1977, Mendes formed a Shapuri Rural Workers Union in Acre. which grew to be 30,000 people strong. Mendez was a modest, hearty person with a magnetic personality, always with a ready smile beneath his imposing moustache. He was an autodidact who learned of the world from the Portuguese language programs of Radio Moscow, Voice of America, and the BBC. These three programs had a lot of power in the Amazon, he recalled in a 1988 interview. Mendez's rise to international prominence came by the way of his friendship with Brazilian anthropologist Mary Allegretti, American conservationist Stephen Schwartzman, and British filmmaker Adrian Cowell, all of whom did sustained work in Acre. When Mendez left Brazil, for the first time, it was to visit the World Bank and senior members of the US Congress. He was there to testify against the bank's support for the environmentally and socially catastrophic Polo Noreste project in the Amazon. Mendez moved easily between the offices of Friends of the Earth in Washington and the campaign trail in Acre, spending weeks and months away from his wife and his two young children. Even as he began to advocate for the rights of the Amazon peoples and its ecosystems on a global stage, Mendez stayed focused on local concerns. The rubber tappers aren't saying that nobody should lay a finger on the Amazon, he insisted. No, we've got our own proposals. At the heart of those alternatives was the idea of extractive reserves, designated areas for the industrial development of commercial forest products. The strand of conservation that rejected development altogether was, for the most part, an elite concern. Hard though it was for some conservationists to accept, the language of extraction was deeply embedded in the ecological consciousness of environmentalists in the global south. Empates, occupations, stayed by the rural unions Mendez supported, turned back chainsaw gangs. Then they achieved a stunning and unexpected legal victory, winning a 61,000-acre tract of land to be set aside as the Pioneer Extractive Reserve. For the powerful Ranchers Association, the União Democrática Ruralista, Mendez's victory was a step too far. Locally, the quest for extractive reserves threatened the power of Dali and Alvarina Alves da Silva, landowners who commanded a phalanx of gunmen and were determined to silence Mendez. Acre's landowners ruled by terror and assassination. By the start of December 1988, at least 90 murders had been recorded in Xapuri that year, few of them ever investigated by a local police force in the pocket of the ranchers. There had been more than one attempt on Mendez's life. He knew he was a marked man. He told a friend, "I am no longer afraid of dying, and I know they can't destroy us." On the evening of December 22, 1988, the Alves family's gunmen lay in wait outside Chico Mendez's home. When Chico came out to bathe in the shed outside, they shot him dead. Some of the blame for hastening the destruction belongs with the cynicism and recklessness of US policy expressed in American support for the coups in Brazil and Indonesia, driven by the belief that the combination of free markets and authoritarian rule would save the world from communism. There is no reason to think that popular democratic governments would have taken a radically different approach to the forest, at least not until the rise of a popular ecological consciousness later in the 20th century. The conquest of nature for land, for livelihoods and for food was integral to the promise of liberatory and democratic movements across Asia and Latin America. But the impunity and violence of the military regimes emboldened by US intervention surely accelerated the harm. Regimes that thought nothing of silencing, imprisoning, torturing, and murdering their opponents were unlikely to take heed of the concerns of indigenous minorities, and still less to care for the suffering of other species. Blinded by righteousness, unaffected by criticism, they saw no reason for precaution. A class of citizens became rich, but a terrible price was paid by the poorest people who suffered the degradation of precious ecologies. Just as China had experienced under Mao, as indigenous Americans had experienced centuries earlier, at the hands of European colonizers, the most rapid destruction of the rainforest and all the life in it accompanied the most brutal abuse of human beings. As we move beyond the obvious culprits, moral certainties blur, and responsibility for harm grows more dispersed. Two planetary transformations sped up in the 1980s, and both pushed the rainforest closer toward irrecoverable loss. The first was the agglomeration of ever more people in cities. For the first time in human history, a large proportion of humanity, rapidly approaching half of all people, no longer lived from the land, no longer lived from growing food. Nowhere was the move to cities faster than in 1980s China, as the Mao government's ideological restraint on urbanization caved to the force of the economic reforms that followed Deng Xiaoping's new maxim, "To get rich is glorious." Shenzhen in the Pearl River Delta was a small town of 60,000 people in 1980. By the end of the decade, it was home, a temporary home at least, to more than 800,000 people, and by 2000, to 6.5 million. The city's population had grown 100 times larger in just 20 years, in what is possibly the fastest growth of a city in human history. China's experience was unique in scale but not in kind. The population of Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, doubled between 1980 and 1990, from 3 million to more than 6 million people, and the population of Nigeria's largest city, Lagos, grew almost as fast. Leading the new ranks of megacities, urban centers of over 10 million people, Mexico City added 2 million new residents in the 1980s to arrive at 15 million. They breathed diesel fumes, heavy metals, solvents, and the noxious compound that urban dwellers knew as hupo, humo, smoke, and polvo, dust. The city's topography, a long legacy of Spanish colonization, contributed to the problem. The drained bed of Lake Texcoco formed the impermeable base of a city in the shape of a bowl, surrounded by high mountains and prone to trapping pollutants. The air bore the emissions of the factories at the heart of the Mexican miracle, which had promised Mexicans prosperity and self-sufficiency. By the 1980s, it also carried the exhaust of hundreds of thousands of automobiles. In 1986, pigeons dropped dead from the skies, their lungs scarred with lead, cadmium, and mercury. The Grupo de los Cien, the Group of 100, led by poet Homero Aretis, mobilized for action. In the 1980s, Aretis later recalled Mexico City suffered such a pollution that sometimes as you were walking down the street, you have the feeling that you are probably going to die in the next corner. Aretis enlisted the support of fellow writers Octavio Paz, Carlos Fuentes, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and allied with citizens groups and young people. The Grupo de los Cien won many small victories. Daily public measurements of atmospheric pollutants, restrictions on vehicle use once a week, and stricter emission standards. Chilangos, residents of Mexico City, struggled to breathe as Londoners and Angelenos had struggled in the 1950s, and their experience would be repeated across the global south in the decades to follow. The Green Revolution made this migration to cities possible. Hybrid seeds, petrochemical fertilizers, and abundant irrigation gave such a boost to harvests of wheat and rice that it seemed by then that the threat of population exceeding the world's food supply was gone. The 1970s prophecies of doom, like Paul Ehrlich's prediction of a great die-off that would kill billions of people, were shown to be fearful fantasies. Between 1961 and 2014, the global production of cereals increased by 280%, far ahead of population growth and achieved with only a 16% increase in the total area of land devoted to raising staple crops. India, China, Mexico, and Brazil led the charge. Between 1970 and 2014, India's production of cereals outstripped the number of new mouths to feed, with only a marginal increase in land area. In China, the growth was even more dramatic, a 420% increase in cereal output with no appreciable rise at all in the expanse of cultivation. Mexico, home to pioneering research on high-yielding varieties, did convert more land to wheat and maize, an increase of around a third, but this still sustained an increase in output of 224%. The Green Revolution was far from universal. Its secret weapon was inequality. It reinforced the gains of farmers who already had access to transportation, plentiful water, and enough money to invest in seeds and chemical pest control. Where those conditions were absent, as they were for small farmers in many regions of sub-Saharan Africa or in rain-fed regions of South Asia, the Green Revolution recorded only modest and patchy results. Where it thrived, the Green Revolution changed everything. It changed how and where and in what concentrations human beings could live. Without this leap in the collective ability of human societies to produce food, such a scale of increase in the world's urban population would have been unimaginable. High-yielding crops fed the voracious appetite of cities for grain as people moved off the land into cities, though often not into formal employment. The Green Revolution owed everything to fossil fuels. Petrochemicals furnished the pesticides and fertilizers that high-yielding seeds depended on. Diesel powered the groundwater pumps that decoupled harvests from rainfall in every region of agrarian prosperity, above all in South Asia. The ecological cost of the Green Revolution accrued as silently as the cancers that afflicted those who inhabited its heartlands. As farmers drilled deeper underground, groundwater tables dropped. As pesticides permeated the earth, toxins dispersed. As monoculture reigned, other forms of life receded. As irrigation water poured over fields, soils grew saline and sterile. The Green Revolution improved and secured the futures of millions of people, many of them migrants to cities, and the Green Revolution wrecked the livelihoods of those who fell outside its creeping embrace, those with land too measly, too stony, too unyielding to accept new seeds. Most of all, it left out rural families who did not own any land at all. High-intensity farming brought its own burdens. Since the late 20th century, India's farmers have committed suicide on a scale without parallel in the world. Starting in the late 1990s, an estimated 17,000 farmers every year have taken their lives in India. At least 200,000 between 1997 and 2010. Debt is the most common source of the intolerable pressure under which India's farmers live and die. Debt to pay for proprietary seeds, petrochemical fertilizers, ever more lethal pesticides, and diesel for pumps. This shadow side of the Green Revolution has contributed as much to the urban transition as its gains. Rural families who felt robbed of a future, caught in a pincer movement between indebtedness and the creeping effects of a changing climate, put all their hopes in sending their sons and daughters to the city. Many new urbanites would find themselves precariously employed through crushing economic vagaries, unsheltered and vulnerable to fire and flood and debilitating accidents, exposed to the threats of unclean water and to fumes from dumping grounds. Success was never so elusive as to dissuade newcomers from taking their chances. The transition to an urban planet could be born of desperation, but it was always clothed in dreams. The big numbers of urbanization spellbind us. Beneath the statistics, however large, lie millions of individual decisions. Decisions to leave, imposed by compounding debts or by sudden family illness. Decisions taken in defiance of the brutality of caste, or made from dauntless hope. Writing in the 1970s, the critic, artist and novelist John Berger, working with photographer Jean Moore, distilled the imaginative draw of cities. Every day he hears about the metropolis. The name of the city changes. It is all cities overlaying one another and becoming a city that exists nowhere, but continually transmits promises. These promises are not transmitted by any single means. They are implicit in the accounts of those who have already been to a city. They are transmitted by machinery, by cars, tractors, tin openers, electric drills, saws, by ready-made clothes, by the planes which fly across the sky, by the nearest main road, by tourist coaches, by a wristwatch. They are there on the radio, in the news, in the music, in the manufacture of the radio itself. Only by going to the city can the meaning of all the promises be realized. Berger's astute observation that the promise of the city lived in mundane objects, tin openers, electric drills, saws, opens a window to understanding the tentacular reach of the world's cities into the rainforest and under the ground. In the everyday life of cities, petrochemicals and timber and paper were woven into the fabric of existence, at once alluring and unremarkable. The more closely observed the account of urban life at this moment of global change, the more ubiquitous the plastic. Vivek Shahbag's Kannada language novel, Gachar Gochar, narrates the story of a South Indian family shaken by the sudden liberation from the grinding struggle for a respectable middle-class existence. It is in no overt sense an ecological novel, but in its fine detail provides more insight into a changing planet than almost any novel I have read. Once, the family had lived in a house with 4 small rooms, one behind the other, like train compartments. Once they had lived through times when the whole family stuck together, walking like a single body across the tightrope of our circumstances. And then, at some unspecified moment in the 1980s or 1990s, Chikapa, the narrator's uncle, persuades the family patriarch to invest in a speculative venture that blooms with the liberalization of India's economy. Shanbhag traces the deeper meanings of the family's changing relationship to things. Early in the novel, the trauma of the father's loss of his salaried job as a salesman comes through in the family's humiliating reversion from a gas to a kerosene stove. The ensuing turnaround in their fortunes depends on the most ubiquitous of all materials, plastic packaging. It's a simple enough business. Order spices in bulk from Kerala, the protagonist tells us. Parcel them into small plastic packets in our warehouse and sell these to grocers in the city. As wealth flows, every relationship comes under strain. It's true what they say. It's not we who control the money, it's the money that controls us, the narrator laments. It is as if that power were irresistible, no less than a force of nature. Money had swept us up and flung us in the midst of a whirlwind. Even if that whirlwind only ever swept up a minority in the global south, even if it left hundreds of millions of people out, it reached widely enough and stimulated enough small desires to leave a lasting imprint upon the earth. The whirlwind uprooted the rainforests of Indonesia in the 1980s and only indirectly through petroleum. The demand came first from the Japanese economic boom. Traders and construction companies from Japan negotiated favorable deals with Indonesia's political elite in the 1970s and 1980s. Cheap Indonesian plywood fueled the construction of skyscrapers and apartment complexes in neon-lit Tokyo, forming the taken-for-granted material fabric of the urban life evoked by that decade's shiny, alluring city pop churned out by the capital's music studios. Old growth trees disappeared, replaced by monoculture plantations for pulp, paper, and cardboard to furnish retailers in Japan, Europe, and North America with attractive packaging, but also paper to furnish local school children, at long last, with textbooks and exercise books. Beginning in the 1980s, intensive pressure on the rainforest came from demand for another substance that began to infiltrate everyday life across the urban planet. Palm was, by the 1990s, the world's preferred vegetable oil. Most of it extracted from palm fruit, with a smaller proportion from crushing palm kernels. It makes shampoos lather and lends lipsticks their smoothness. It gives cookies their texture and raises the melting point of ice cream. Palm oil, native to West Africa, had first been used as an alternative to animal fat in the late 19th century, forged by Liverpool's Lever Brothers into bars of Sunlight brand soap. It was less pungent than tallow in candles, and in factories it lubricated engines. Palm was growing on plantations, most notoriously in the Belgian Congo, where coerced workers endured conditions not far removed from slavery. Only a whole century after its initial industrial deployment did palm acquire primacy among vegetable oils, and now with Southeast Asia rather than West Africa as the main region of production. For newly independent countries in Southeast Asia, palm offered a path out of poverty. General Suharto's bloody 1965 coup yanked Indonesia away from Sukarno's left-leaning economic policies. Declaring a new order, the Suharto government radically centralized control over land. The state took over a significant proportion of Indonesia's forests, especially on the outer islands, which they operated directly as state-owned plantations or leased out to private interests. The forest department grew all-powerful in areas designated as political forests, zoning different parts of the forest for development and preservation, but always at the expense of customary and indigenous land claims. Finding a receptive ear in Suharto's government, now advised by a Barclay mafia of US-trained Indonesian economists, the World Bank promoted the export of palm oil as a spur to growth. Neighbouring Malaysia faced a collapse in markets for its main export, natural rubber, thanks to the rise of cheap synthetic alternatives. There too, palm was a promising replacement. The area planted with palm more than trebled in Indonesia between 1970 and 1985, with state-owned and politically affiliated plantations. The distinctions easily blurred, supported by loans from the World and Asian Development Banks. In neither Indonesia nor Malaysia was palm production exclusively in the hands of large plantations. Around a third of global output has always come from small farms, but because of how rapidly the fruit spoils, smallholders have often had no choice but to sell to the processing plants that only larger firms could afford to build. In 1981, a humble breakthrough galvanized the advantage of palm over competing oils, thrusting Malaysia to the top rank among the world's producers. Leslie Davidson, a Scot who had worked for Unilever from the age of 20, commissioned a team of entomologists to investigate a phenomenon he had observed while working in Cameroon. Yields there were better than in Malaysia, and Davidson had noticed that the palm fruits were often surrounded by weevils. Davidson's hunch proved right. The study showed that palms were pollinated by weevils and not by wind dispersal. Unilever brought weevils from Cameroon to Malaysia, and yields jumped, just in time to meet rising demand. Concern about the health effects of trans fats in wealthy countries led to their substitution with palm oil in processed foods. Palm was handy too as a cheap biofuel, ready to be deployed when ecological concern about fossil fuels began to escalate in Europe. In 1970, the total world production of palm oil was 2 million tons, and palm was third behind groundnut and cottonseed among the most commonly used vegetable oils. Palm oil production had leapt to 7.5 million tons and the top rank by 1985, and by 1995 output had doubled again. By 2005, the world produced more than 32 million tons of palm oil, almost 6 times more than groundnut. Since the 1980s, Indonesia and Malaysia together have produced around 85% of the world's palm oil, and that figure has changed little to this day. 10 years after Davidson's weevil discovery, 2 entrepreneurs, Singaporean Kuk Kung Hong and Martua Sutorus, an Indonesian, co-founded Wilmar International. As demand for palm surged in the 1990s, Wilmar quickly became its largest trader and one of the biggest agribusiness firms in the world. Wilmar has faced accusations of both environmental irresponsibility and exploitative labor practices. Palm oil has been used, first and foremost, in food production. Most of the added production since the 1990s has been consumed not in the global north. Demand from North America and the European Union accounted for only 15% of global consumption of palm oil by the 2010s, but rather and overwhelmingly within Asia. In India, in China, and in Indonesia itself, palm oil was used primarily as a cheap and relatively nutritious cooking fat. And as the growing middle classes of those countries sought convenience foods, palm oil insinuated itself ever more firmly into people's diets, not least as an essential ingredient in instant noodles. Palm met the nutritional needs of an urbanizing Asia with a colossal environmental impact, but an impact that was still smaller than would have been the case with any known alternative, given that palm uses only a fifth as much land for the same yield as soy and other vegetable oils. What palm demonstrates is more broadly true. The prime motor of environmental change in the 1980s and 1990s, still the factor above all others, was what and how people chose to eat. During the 1980s, the proportion of the world's fisheries classed as overexploited, where rates of capture exceeded the ability of fish populations to reproduce, jumped from 13% to more than 26%. The ecological impact of meat was greater still. The main driver of forest loss in the Amazon was the search for pasture to raise cattle for beef. Until the end of the 20th century, almost all of Brazil's beef was destined for domestic consumption, not for export, and the search for ever more meat was propelled by domestic politics. Ranchers trusted in the constant flow of handouts from the state to make their business viable, and they relied on the state's complicity in their land grabs. But the story is incomplete without accounting for the politically assertive desire of Brazilian voters for beef on their dinner tables. Outside interests were ready and waiting to profit from Brazilians' taste for meat. The Brazilian state was so deeply in debt to northern governments and northern commercial banks that debt repayments, at one point in the early 1980s, added up to almost 30% of export revenues. To boost export earnings to keep up with loan payments, the state encouraged the further destruction of rainforest to be planted with commodity crops. Brazil's exports of both meat and soy surged as a result, with global markets now propelling a further spate of deforestation. The Green Revolution made hunger a distant memory for a substantial number of people, though never for the poorest in each society. And it did so permanently and securely enough that their very expectations of life changed. They desired to eat differently and to eat better. What the middle classes of Asia and Latin America desired most of all was what had earlier been scarce, and that was the meat and fish that European and American consumers had devoured with abandon for a century or more, so much so that they considered it almost a customary right. Now, it was others' turn to eat.